6 hours on October 24th, 1929 saw Americans losing $14 billion, more than the entire Canadian economy was worth at the time. 13 million shares sold in panic as phone lines couldn't handle the volume, and communication with the stock exchange was cut off completely. Black Thursday arrived, but few people know this crash began with the decision of just one man, a man whom newspapers called Sunshine Charlie and America's most popular banker. Charles Mitchell was his name, and he was the one who triggered what we now call the Great Depression. 7 months earlier, Mitchell uttered a phrase supposed to save the American economy, but instead set in motion the mechanism of the most terrible crash in human history. A depression lasting 10 years that changed an entire generation's lives. 25 million people lost their jobs, making every fourth person unemployed. 5,000 banks closed forever, taking with them the savings of millions of families, while 2 million Americans became homeless, and families lived in cardboard boxes in tent cities bitterly called Hoovervilles, where suicides increased by 30%. A country that just yesterday considered itself the richest in the world now had people standing in lines for free bread. But how did it all begin? The 1920s brought America an unprecedented boom. The roaring 20s with Ford cars and radios in every home and jazz clubs and rising skyscrapers. It seemed prosperity would last forever. And then a man stepped onto the scene who would turn the dream of wealth into a nightmare for millions. Charles Edwin Mitchell was born in 1877 to a farmer's family in Massachusetts, where nothing predicted this simple man's son would become America's most influential banker and change an entire nation's fate. In 1919, Mitchell headed National City Bank, the country's largest bank, with assets of $2.7 billion, more than the budget of most countries at that time. But the ambitious banker had a revolutionary idea that would change everything. Before, Mitchell stocks were rich men's toys where only 500,000 Americans, less than 1% of the population, owned stocks. Ordinary people kept money in banks or bought bonds, while the stock market remained a closed club for the elite. But Mitchell saw huge opportunity in this. Every American should be a capitalist, he said, asking why should wealth belong only to the wealthy. In 1920, Mitchell created a subsidiary company called National City Company with a simple task: sell stocks to ordinary Americans right in bank branches. When a person came to open a savings account, they were offered to invest in the American dream instead. Before we continue, though, understanding how one banker's sales tactics can trigger nationwide economic collapse diverges sharply from what business schools teach. Real financial history requires studying these individual decision points, so hit that subscribe button because it helps the channel, and these crash mechanics need exposing. Drop a comment too, because I want knowing if you think Mitchell was evil or just ambitious. Mitchell studied every detail from sales psychology to human greed to the dreams of ordinary Americans, and his salespeople were placed in 69 bank branches across the country. These weren't boring bankers, but real dream merchants trained according to Mitchell's special program. The advertising was revolutionary for its time, where ads appeared in newspapers saying, "Get rich by investing just $15 a month and become a partner of American Telephone and Telegraph. And your children will be proud of you. You're an investor." Magazines published success stories about how a secretary from Ohio became rich in 2 years, while a streetcar driver bought his own house with dividends. Salespeople use clever tricks, telling clients, "Mr. Johnson, you don't want to work for someone else your whole life, do you? General Electric stocks are your chance to become master of your own destiny." Or, "Mrs. Smith, your husband works for Ford, so why don't you become a co-owner of the company?" National City Company offices were decorated with posters showing happy families against the backdrop of big houses with messages saying, "Thanks to stocks we bought our dream home." Happy faces and expensive cars and smiling children, everything screamed this could be your life. But the real genius was in the credit scheme, where stocks could be bought on margin by putting down only 10% of your own money and borrowing the rest from the bank. Imagine you have $100 and you buy $1,000 worth of stocks. If they grow by 20%, you earn $200, doubling your money, and salespeople demonstrated this with simple examples saying, "Look, Mr. Brown bought Radio Corporation stocks for $500, investing only $50, and in 6 months they grew by $150, giving him profit of 300%, while your money in the bank would have brought only 15%. The result exceeded all expectations. From 1925 to 1929, the volume of loans for stock purchases grew from $2 billion to $8.5 billion, a 425% increase in 4 years. And the number of Americans owning stocks grew from 500,000 to 10 million people. A teacher from Ohio mortgaged her house for Radio Corporation stocks, while a farmer from Kansas sold his cattle to buy General Motors papers, and a mechanic from Detroit invested 6 months' salary in Ford stocks. Everyone believed this was their chance to get rich, and Mitchell basked in the glory, being called a financial genius and a democratizer of Wall Street, where in 1928 he earned $1.2 million, equivalent to $20 million today. But Mitchell went further by creating investment trusts, funds that bought stocks with borrowed money, where these trusts themselves became joint stock companies whose stocks were again bought on credit. The result was a pyramid of debts built on the hope that prices would rise forever. By spring 1929, even the most optimistic economists began to worry because stock prices were rising faster than the economy. The Federal Reserve System sounded the alarm that the market was overheated, and the numbers were frightening, where major company stocks were trading at prices 15 times their annual profit, a ratio considered today as a sign of speculative bubble. On February 6, 1929, the Federal Reserve System issued a warning to banks demanding they stop issuing loans for speculation in the stock market and limiting margin lending. The market's reaction was immediate as stocks began to fall in March, where in a few days Americans lost billions and panic was growing. It seemed the bubble had burst. And then on March 12, 1929, Charles Mitchell made a decision that changed the course of history by calling a press conference and speaking words that will go down in history. National City Bank will provide the market with all the liquidity it needs, and we will not allow an unnecessary crisis to occur. The effect was immediate. Newspapers came out with headlines saying, "Sunshine Charlie saves the market as stocks bounce back," and in 1 week, the market recovered all losses and went to new records. After Mitchell's statement, the market entered the final phase of madness. Summer 1929 saw stocks reaching historic highs, where the Dow Jones index rose to 381 points, a record that wouldn't be beaten for the next 25 years. 3 million new Americans entered the market in the last months before the crash. Wives secretly pawned jewelry to buy stocks while shoe shiners gave investment advice, and even children spent pocket money on papers. Those who entered the market earlier felt like geniuses, where simple clerks became millionaires on paper, and chauffeurs bought mansions and secretaries bought fur coats. America was intoxicated with the illusion of endless wealth. But behind the facade of prosperity lurked the mathematics of catastrophe, where every dollar invested in stocks was backed by only 10 cents of real money. With a 10% price drop, the margin investor lost everything, and with a 50% drop, they owed the bank more than they earned in a year. By fall 1929, smart money began to get nervous. Large institutional investors and pension funds and insurance companies and banks saw warning signs that escaped ordinary people's attention. First, economic indicators were deteriorating. Industrial production slowed while car sales fell and new home construction decreased, but stocks continued rising, ignoring reality, where the gap between the stock market and the economy became critical. Second, smart investors understood the mathematics of margin trading better than others, seeing when 90% of money in the market was borrowed funds, any decline would turn into catastrophe. Joseph Kennedy, father of the future president, later recounted, "When the shoe shiner started giving me stock advice, I knew it was time to sell." Third insiders knew about Federal Reserve System plans, where the central bank was preparing to raise interest rates, which would make margin loans more expensive and could trigger mass selling. Large players began quietly taking profits by selling in small portions so as not to crash the market prematurely, but by October, patience ran out. On the morning of October 24, 1929, New York's largest investment funds made a coordinated decision that time had come to exit, and they began selling in large blocks where hundreds of thousands of shares went simultaneously. Prices crawled down, first slowly, then in an avalanche, and by noon, panic began. In one day, they sold a record 13 million shares, 5 times more than usual. Brokers couldn't process orders while the telephone system couldn't handle the load. The domino effect that Mitchell had unwittingly created with his system was launched. First domino, falling prices forced banks to demand additional contributions from margin investors. Second domino, people had no money for additional payments, forcing them to sell stocks, which further crashed prices. Third domino, falling prices made stocks unsuitable as collateral for new loans where banks stopped lending, which deprived the market of liquidity. Fourth domino, banks that had issued too many margin loans began to go bankrupt, where the first to fall were those who followed Mitchell's example. October 29th brought Black Tuesday and the final crash. In one day, Americans lost $14 billion, more than the U.S. spent on the entire World War I. Behind the dry numbers hit human tragedies. Edward Hopkins, a mechanic from Detroit, bought Ford stocks for $5,000, representing his life savings, and by November they were worth $200, while the bank demanded an additional $3,000. Hopkins hanged himself in his garage. Mary Cafield, a teacher from Ohio, mortgaged her parents' house to buy Radio Corporation stocks, and after the crash, the bank repossessed the house, leaving a family of 3 generations on the street. In New York, lines formed not only at banks, but also on bridges. Suicides reached record levels where the Brooklyn Bridge became a symbol of despair, and those who just yesterday considered themselves millionaires ended their lives there. In 1933, Mitchell was called before Congress, where Senator Carter Glass asked, "Do you consider yourself responsible for the ruin of millions of American families?" Mitchell replied, "I wanted to give people the opportunity to get rich, and no one forced them to buy stocks." But justice caught up with Sunshine Charlie. In 1933, he was tried for tax evasion of $850,000 and was forced to resign in complete disgrace. And the man who was called the market savior became a symbol of greed and irresponsibility. American society was divided in its attitude towards Mitchell. The New York Times called him the architect of financial catastrophe and the man who turned the American dream into a nightmare, and ordinary Americans hated him with all their hearts, where on the streets of New York, he was booed. One Detroit newspaper wrote Charles Mitchell stole more from us than any bank robber in history because a robber takes a bag of money, but Mitchell took the future from an entire generation. But there were also defenders. Many businessmen said Mitchell didn't force anyone to buy stocks where people themselves chose greed over caution, and his former colleagues claimed Charlie just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, arguing any banker in his position would have done the same. As for National Citibank, paradoxically, the bank not only survived the crisis, but strengthened. After Mitchell's resignation, the new management shut down all risky operations focusing on conservative deposits and loans, and the bank received government support as too big to fail. Moreover, the collapse of competitors allowed National City to absorb their assets for pennies, where by 1935, the bank controlled an even larger market segment than before the crisis. Mitchell himself spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity. After the trial, he moved to Europe, where he worked as a consultant for small banks, and returning to the U.S. in the 1940s, he founded a modest investment company. Sunshine Charlie became an elderly man remembered only as a symbol of 1920s greed. Mitchell died in 1955 at the age of 78, never acknowledging his responsibility for the Great Depression. The catastrophe triggered by Mitchell changed the American financial system forever. In 1933, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act, separating commercial and investment banks, where the goal was simple: never again allow bankers to gamble with depositors' money. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to oversee the market, while bank deposit insurance was established, and strict requirements for margin trading were introduced. America swore this would never happen again, but the government also took more radical measures. In April 1933, President Roosevelt signed an executive order that shook the foundations of the American economy by prohibiting private individuals from owning gold, and all Americans were required to surrender their gold coins and bars to the government at a fixed price. This was a desperate attempt to regain control over the monetary system, because as long as people could demand gold for dollars, the government couldn't print money to fight the Depression. Gold confiscation allowed increasing the money supply and reducing deflation, but the price was violating Americans' fundamental right to own precious metals. In a month, Americans surrendered more than 3,600 tons of gold, more than the current reserves of Russia and China combined. A year later, the government raised the official price of gold from $20 to $35 per ounce, earning billions of dollars on the confiscated metal. The scars of the Great Depression remained for generations, where the American economy recovered for 10 years and millions of people forever lost faith in the stock market. An entire generation preferred to keep money under the mattress rather than trust banks. Today, almost a century later, history repeats with frightening accuracy. 50 million Americans trade stocks through smartphones, while the volume of margin loans has reached a record $900 billion. And apps like Robinhood promise the same thing Mitchell offered. Make everyone an investor with zero commissions and trade like a pro, and invest your paycheck. A new generation invests in cryptocurrencies and meme stocks, borrowing money on margin accounts with the same promises of easy money and the same cheap loans. The same mechanism Mitchell created almost 100 years ago is back. The average American today owes more than they earn in a year. Margin trading has reached 1929 levels, and again, millions of people believe that this time is different. Charles Mitchell's story is about how good intentions can lead to catastrophe because he really wanted to give ordinary people a chance to get rich. But his system turned the American dream into a nightmare for a quarter of the country's population. Every American should be a capitalist, Mitchell said in 1928. Everyone should invest, they say today, and history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Thanks for watching. Here's what I want. Knowing from you, though. If you were an American in 1929 with your life savings and Mitchell's salespeople were offering you stocks on margin promising wealth, would you have seen through the pitch and stayed out? Or would the social pressure and success stories have pulled you in like millions of others? That question determines whether you're the type who survives the next crash or becomes a cautionary tale in the history books. So drop your take in the comments because I genuinely want hearing if you think you would have been different next time you hear promises of easy money and calls to democratize finance. Remember Sunshine Charlie and ask who will really profit because the playbook is back and the ending is always the same. Subscribe to the channel because there will be many more such stories ahead, and the next crash is coming for those who don't study history.